In a quiet town, a woman scrubs the floors and counts every dollar just to survive and keep her father's diner alive. But when a weary black man walks in, she serves him with dignity and gives away half her savings to help his sick daughter. Her kindness comes at a steep cost. Customers vanish. Hope fades. But what she doesn't know is that the man she helped will soon return, with a second chance that will change her life forever. Before we dive in this story, let us know where you're watching from. We love to hear your thoughts. The morning air in Fairview carried that peculiar stillness of a town too tired to bustle. At Mira's corner, the old ceiling fan creaked in slow rhythmic sweeps, barely pushing around the sticky heat that clung to the faded booths and chipped counters. The diner smelled faintly of burnt toast, strong coffee, and lemon disinfectant, familiar and tired, like the woman who moved behind the counter. Mira Thompson's hands were raw from scrubbing, red from the bleach, and stiff from the early shift. She rubbed her wrists and glanced toward the register, where yesterday's meager earnings sat folded in a cracked leather pouch, just over $38. It wouldn't even dent the electric bill waiting in her purse. A final notice bleeding red through the envelope. "Just one more week," she murmured, brushing a dark curl from her cheek. It was a lie she'd whispered so often it sounded almost like a prayer now. One more week to figure it out. One more week to hold it all together. The diner was empty again, save for the occasional retired couple or construction worker grabbing a bite between gigs. The town had shrunk over the years, like an old sweater gone threadbare. Ever since the textile mill shut down its third shift, people had started moving away. Storefronts that once held promise now sat hollowed and sun-bleached. And Mira, once a nurse in the city, had come back to care for her father after the stroke that stole his voice, his movement, and her career. She glanced at the photo taped to the wall above the coffee station. Her father grinning in his grease-stained apron, lifting a pie like it was a trophy. "Hospitality is a kind of kindness," he used to say, "and kindness is never wasted." But kindness didn't pay rent. Mira exhaled slowly and reached for the toolkit hidden beneath the counter. The front sign had started tilting again. A windstorm last week had knocked the screws loose. She'd planned to use the little money she'd saved to fix it this weekend, maybe repaint the windows too, make the place look like it had some fight left in it. Instead, she'd probably have to choose between paint and keeping the lights on. Outside, Fairview's main road sat quiet, a stretch of silence broken only by the occasional truck groaning by. It felt like the town was holding its breath, waiting for something to change. Mira adjusted the open sign and turned back to the kitchen, unaware that today, change had already begun walking her way. The bell above the door gave a soft jingle, cheerful, almost out of place, and Mira looked up from the coffee pot out of habit more than hope. Her breath caught for just a moment. A man stood in the doorway, tall, broad-shouldered, and unmistakably tired. His clothes were worn, his boots dusty, and his dark skin drew instant, uncomfortable silence from the handful of customers scattered through the diner. He carried no backpack, no briefcase, just the weight of exhaustion draped across his back like a coat. He moved slowly toward the counter, each step heavy, deliberate, as though he'd been walking for miles. Mira could feel the shift in the air. How eyes followed him, how forks paused mid-bite. Mr. and Mrs. Bellinger, seated by the window, leaned toward each other and whispered. The young man at the corner booth, who'd been scrolling on his phone, narrowed his eyes and stiffened. Even the music from the old jukebox seemed to fumble into static. She saw it in their faces. Not fear, not curiosity, judgment. Cold and immediate. The man took the stool at the far end of the counter, the one closest to the window, farthest from everyone else. A place for someone used to being pushed aside. Mira grabbed a menu and a glass of water, her movements steady even as her chest tightened. She caught herself smoothing her apron, a nervous habit, before approaching him with the same calm smile she gave everyone else. She felt the eyes of the room shift to her too, not with fear, but with silent questioning. What would a woman like her, white, local, familiar, do when someone like him sat down? "Welcome to Mira's Corner," she said softly. "Coffee's hot. Today's special is eggs and grits, made fresh this morning." He looked up, and Mira was struck. His eyes, deep brown, rimmed red, carried the weight of miles, but also something else. Grief. A kind of hollow that felt all too familiar, the kind she'd seen in hospital waiting rooms, the kind people carried when holding on by the last thread. "Coffee," he said, voice low and a little raspy. "Black. And whatever's fast. I've been on the road since before sunup." She nodded and poured from the battered percolator behind her. As she placed the cup in front of him, she noticed his hands, large, weathered, but trembling slightly. His knuckles were raw, and half him beneath the cuff of his sleeve was a hospital bracelet. "Still got a long drive?" she asked gently, her voice not pressing but curious, like her father used to ask strangers about their journeys. He took a sip, cradling the cup like it held more than caffeine. "Riverside General," he said after a pause. "My daughter's there. She's not doing good." He didn't say more. Didn't have to. Mira heard the words he couldn't speak. She saw them in his eyes, and in that moment he wasn't a stranger, not someone to be whispered about, just a father doing what he could. He was a father, holding it together by sheer will. "I'll get your order in," she said quietly. "Eggs and toast, 6 minutes, tops." As she turned to call it in, she heard the murmurs ripple through the diner again, Mrs. Bellinger clutching her purse tighter, the young man at the booth shaking his head, one of the old-timers muttering, "What's a man like that doing in Fairview?" But Mira didn't flinch. She moved with purpose, with calm, because her father had taught her long ago, "You don't judge a man by his color, you judge him by his eyes." And this man's eyes told her everything she needed to know. The bell jingled again, sharper this time, and Mira didn't have to look up to know trouble had just walked in. She recognized the heavy footsteps of Officer Klein even before she saw his reflection in the chrome napkin holder. Broad, smug, and always too loud for a man who claimed to keep the peace. Behind him was his younger partner, Officer Delaney, eyes constantly scanning, always a step behind in more ways than one. "Morning, Mira," Klein called, already heading toward the counter like he owned the place. "Heard you're serving new clientele these days." Mira didn't respond right away. She was plating eggs and toast with practiced focus, trying to pretend her stomach hadn't just tied itself into a knot. Caleb, still hunched over his coffee at the far end, kept his gaze fixed out the window. Mira could see his jaw tighten. The two officers didn't sit at their usual booth. Instead, they flanked Caleb like wolves cornering prey. Klein dropped onto the stool beside him with a smirk that never reached his eyes. "Well now," he said, dragging the words. "Don't often see folks like you in Fairview, just passing through, are we?" Caleb didn't flinch. "Just getting food, officer," he said quietly. Mira stepped in then, placing the plate of eggs and toast in front of Caleb with care. "Anything else I can get you?" she asked, her voice even but firm. Before he could answer, Klein cut in. "Yeah, Mira. How about checking his ID, make sure we're not harboring anyone the county might be looking for?" The room fell into that awful kind of hush, the kind that crackled with tension. Mira saw Mrs. Bellinger stop chewing. The kid in the corner booth sat up straighter, clearly entertained. Even Delaney looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight. Caleb moved slowly, deliberately reaching into his jacket, but Klein's hand twitched toward his holster like it was second nature. Mira's breath caught. "Easy," Caleb said, pulling out a worn wallet, placing it on the counter without opening it. "That's enough," Mira snapped, louder than she meant to. All heads turned, even the fan seemed to hesitate. "He's a paying customer, just like you." Klein didn't budge. "Not just like me," he said, leaning forward, voice low and taunting. "His kind brings trouble, always has, always will." Caleb looked up for the first time, his voice still steady but with an edge now. "You don't know a damn thing about me." Delaney shifted again, uneasy. "Maybe we should just run his plates," he muttered. Mira's heart pounded in her ears. She didn't care who was watching. She knew this was the moment they expected her to look away, to keep her head down and say nothing, the safe thing, the quiet thing, but silence had never sat right in her bones. "Unless he's broken a law, you don't have the right to harass him in my diner. My father built this place on respect, and I won't let you tear it down over your own fear." Klein stood then, towering, puffed up like a challenge. Your daddy would be ashamed, Mira, turning your back on your own kind. Mira's hands were shaking, but her voice didn't waver. My daddy taught me to stand up for what's right. He'd be ashamed if I didn't. No one moved. The silence was heavier now, judgment crawling across every table, every inch of tile. I'll take my food to go, Caleb said quietly, reaching for his wallet again. No, Mira said more gently this time. Your money's no good here today. He looked at her, confused, touched, grateful. Maybe he hadn't expected someone like her to stand up for him. Maybe that was the saddest part, that kindness from someone like Mira felt unusual. Klein's face turned a dark shade of red. You're making a mistake, Mira. This town remembers. She met his glare head on. Then let it remember who stood for decency. Klein threw a few crumpled bills on the counter. Lost my appetite. Let's go, Delaney. The bell clanged sharply as they left. Conversation resumed slowly, awkwardly, like nothing had happened. But Mira knew something had. Something important. Caleb finished his meal in silence. When he stood to leave, he placed a 20 on the counter despite her protests. For your dad, he said simply. Then he walked out, shoulders still heavy, but just a little straighter than before. Mira watched him go, the 20 still warm in her hand, her chest tight with something she couldn't quite name. Gratitude, maybe, sadness. The feeling that she'd just watched a good man walk out into a world that didn't deserve him. The bell above the door gave one last quiet jingle, then silence settled over the diner like a damp blanket. She stared out the window long after Caleb had disappeared down Main Street, that old ache building behind her ribs, something in the way he had said for your dad, like he knew what it meant to carry the weight of someone else's fight. Later that afternoon, when the lunch crowd had thinned to nothing and the coffee pot sat cold and half empty, Mira locked up the register and ducked into the back room. The money she'd been saving, every tip, every spare dollar, sat inside a plain white envelope tucked behind the breaker panel. Just under $700. It wasn't much, but it was enough to patch the roof and repaint the faded sign. She'd planned it carefully, budgeted every cent. But her hands didn't move toward the toolbox. They reached instead for the envelope. She hesitated, fingers trembling. Caleb hadn't asked for help. He hadn't even hinted. But that hospital bracelet, those eyes. Mira had seen too many fathers like him in the ER. The ones who skipped meals so their kid could get meds. The ones who nodded through instructions but didn't have the gas money to get back the next day. The ones who didn't cry, because if they started, they might never stop. She didn't think. She just moved. Grabbing a clean napkin, she scribbled 4 words. For your daughter's care. Folded it neatly. Slipped the envelope inside his jacket pocket, which he'd left draped over the back of the stool while he used the restroom. He never noticed, or if he did, he didn't say. When he came back, she smiled like nothing had changed, just poured him a fresh cup of coffee and asked if he needed anything else for the road. He shook his head. Said thank you again, softly, like it mattered. Then he was gone. The diner felt quieter without him. Mira stood there, one hand still resting on the counter where he'd sat, the other brushing her apron absently. The wind picked up outside, tugging at the crooked sign above the door. It squeaked softly in protest, like it knew repair would have to wait. She didn't regret it. Not even a little. The next morning, the air in Fairview felt different. Not colder, not warmer, just colder in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. Mira pulled into the gravel lot behind the diner just before sunrise, her keys already in hand. She was tired, but not from lack of sleep. It was the kind of tired that settled in your bones when you'd given away something you couldn't afford and still knew it was the right thing to do. As she rounded the corner to unlock the front door, she stopped short. There was a sign taped across the window, big red letters, sloppy and aggressive. We don't serve drifters, or the ones who protect them. Below it, someone had scrawled in Sharpie, Fairview looks out for its own. Mira's stomach turned. Her fingers curled slowly around the keyring. She tore the paper down in one swift motion, crumpling it in her fist. Her hand trembled, not with fear, but with something heavier. Not surprise, not here. just the familiar sting of disappointment. Inside, nothing had been touched, no broken windows, no spray paint, no smashed furniture, just that note, just a warning, the kind that pretended to be polite, the kind that said, "We're watching you." By 8 o'clock it was obvious the message had gotten around. The usual crowd, contractors, delivery drivers, a pair of farmers from the outskirts, they didn't come. The bell above the door barely moved all morning. Mira stood behind the counter like a soldier at her post, pouring coffee that no one ordered, wiping counters that didn't need cleaning. At 10:15, the first customer walked in. Mrs. Evelyn Harper, retired English teacher, all of 5 feet tall, with a voice like gravel and the spine of a lioness. She slid into her usual booth and ordered her usual tuna melt, pausing only to pat Mira's hand gently as she added, "Small towns forget fast, honey, but the right ones remember longer." Next came Dave and Marcia Watson, former high school sweethearts turned high school janitors, who sat right in the front window like a statement. "Still the best damn coffee in Fairview," Dave said, voice too loud on purpose. But Mira could do the math. A few gestures of loyalty didn't change the reality. The tables stayed empty. The silence in the diner roared louder than the breakfast radio station. She counted 5 paying customers by noon, less than a third of what she needed to break even. She didn't need a calculator to know she couldn't survive another week like this. By 2, with no one left inside but the ticking clock and the smell of burnt coffee grounds, Mira leaned against the counter, her arms crossed tight, as if she could hold herself together that way. She'd tried to do something good. And now the town was turning its back. The worst part wasn't the money, it wasn't even the fear. It was the quiet, the knowing that the same people she'd grown up with, the same folks who used to pinch her cheeks and slip her candy when her dad was cooking in the back, were the ones now deciding she wasn't their kind anymore. And yet, she still didn't regret it. But regret and reality were different things. And as the sun dipped behind the town water tower, Mira began to wonder how much longer she could keep this place alive. It was 3 days later when the bell above the door rang again, not soft or uncertain like before, but clear, deliberate. Mira looked up from where she was refilling the salt shakers, not expecting much. The lunch hour had come and gone with barely a whisper, and her shoulders ached from carrying trays that stayed empty. A man stood in the doorway, tall and broad-shouldered, but something about him looked lighter. The same worn boots, same strong posture, but his coat was clean, his shirt freshly pressed. There was a calm to him now, like someone who had just stepped out of a storm and found still water on the other side. "Afternoon, Miss Mira," he said, voice warm. Mira froze. "Caleb?" He nodded, that same quiet smile playing at the corner of his mouth. "Hope I'm not catching you at a bad time." She blinked, stunned. "This whole week's been a bad time," she said, before she could stop herself. Then, softening, "But, no. You're never a bad time." He stepped inside, letting the door close behind him. "You got a minute? There's something I think you ought to see." Before she could answer, he turned back to the lot outside and waved once. A few seconds later, the back doors of a long black van swung open. 2 men stepped out, then a woman, all carrying crates and toolboxes. More followed. People of every shape and age, some in work boots, some in sneakers, all walking with purpose. Mira stepped forward, confusion blooming in her chest. "What is this?" Caleb turned to her, and for the first time she saw the full weight of what he was carrying. Grief, yes, but also something stronger underneath. Resolve. Hope. "My daughter," he said. "Janelle. The surgery, it worked. The doctors say she's got a fighting chance now. First good news I've had in a long time." Mira's hand flew to her mouth. "Oh my God, that's wonderful." "I found the envelope," he said gently. "Didn't open it until we got to the hospital. Figured maybe it was a thank you note." He paused. "Didn't expect to find the kind of money someone saves to fix their roof." Mira looked away, embarrassed. "I didn't do it to be repaid." "I know," Caleb said. "And that's why I'm here. You gave me something when no one else even gave me a second glance. You saw me as a man, not a threat. not a problem, just a father. He turned toward the window, where more people were now gathering outside the diner. Some were unloading planks of wood, others climbing ladders to inspect the crooked sign Mira had never gotten to fix. I own a small remodeling firm in New Orleans. Good folks, tight crew. When I told them what happened here, they volunteered to help. Mira stared, speechless. We're going to patch that roof, Caleb continued. Fix the sign, touch up the windows, clean the vents, maybe rethink the flow of the kitchen. You've been cooking like it's 1982 back there. A laugh escaped her, sudden and sharp. Well, it is my dad's setup. He smiled. And we'll keep the heart of it, but we're going to make it shine again. She shook her head, overwhelmed. I don't know what to say. Say thank you, Caleb said. Then let us get to work. Mira stood at the edge of her own dream, watching strangers, no, friends, pour into her little corner of Fairview like sunlight breaking through heavy clouds. Something inside her cracked open then. Something that had been bracing for collapse finally exhaled. And as the drills hummed to life and the first coat of new paint hit the old trim, she whispered, more to herself than anyone else, maybe kindness really does come back around. The smell of fresh paint mixed with coffee and sunlight as Mira stepped out onto the sidewalk, blinking against the brightness. It had only been a week since Caleb returned, but the diner hardly looked the same. The sagging front awning had been replaced with a sleek wooden beam, carved carefully with the new slogan beneath the old name. Mira's Corner, where everyone's welcome. The windows gleamed, the once faded trim now a warm yellow that caught the morning light like butter melting on pancakes. Inside, the booths had been reupholstered, the kitchen flow reworked with the kind of care only someone who understood the rhythm of cooking could manage. But more than that, the soul of the place had changed. It wasn't just fixed, it was alive. That morning, before the sun had fully risen, they'd opened the doors to the community for a pay-what-you-can breakfast. It was Caleb's idea. Start from the heart, he'd said. Let people come for the food, but stay for the feeling. And they did. The line went around the block. Not just locals. People from 3 towns over, drivers who'd heard the story on social media, members of Caleb's community from New Orleans who'd made the trip just to say thank you, black families, white families, young couples, retired veterans, single moms, even a group of teens on skateboards. They came in waves, hungry, curious, smiling. Some brought pie, some brought flowers, some brought nothing but open hearts. Mira moved through it all like a conductor guiding a living symphony, pouring coffee, sliding plates, hugging strangers who didn't feel like strangers for long. Her shoes hurt, her apron was stained, but she couldn't stop smiling. At one point she looked up to find Officer Delaney at the counter, looking sheepish but genuine. He ordered a coffee and handed over a 5 without a word. When their eyes met, he nodded once, small but real. Mira nodded back. Some walls took longer to come down, but cracks had started forming. Outside, someone had set up a speaker, soft jazz playing under the murmur of laughter and forks on ceramic. Kids chalked rainbows onto the sidewalk. Old men argued good-naturedly about who made the best grits. A little girl with braids ran up and tugged Mira's sleeve. "Are you the lady who helped the man with a sick daughter?" Mira knelt beside her. "I just gave him breakfast, sweetheart." The girl grinned. "My mom says that's how heroes start." As the sun dipped low, casting golden shadows across the street, Caleb joined her at the doorway, a to-go cup in hand. "You see what you started?" Mira looked around, at the full tables, the shared stories, the people who had once turned away now sitting side by side. She nodded slowly. "I thought I was saving a diner." "You did more than that," Caleb said. "You gave people a reason to believe in each other again." He reached into his truck and handed her something wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a custom-made apron, thick canvas, stitched with care. On the chest, embroidered in clean, bold thread, "The Heart of Fairview," and below it, in Caleb's own handwriting, "For the woman who reminded us how to treat each other." Because sometimes the ones who look safest in the system have the most power to disrupt it, if they're willing to use it right. She stood frozen for a moment, the weight of it all settling around her shoulders like a blanket on a cold morning. No speeches, no tears, just a breath, deep and full. That night, after the last customer left and the chairs were stacked, Mira hung the new apron beside her father's old one on the wall. 2 pieces of fabric, 2 lives, 1 purpose. The diner was quiet again, but this time it wasn't the silence of loneliness. It was the hush of something sacred. Because Mira Thompson hadn't just served breakfast. She'd served a lesson. And Fairview had finally learned how to listen. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.